So bad news for those that want Nvidia lower GPU prices. People are buying this guy. This is the 4070 Ti, and right now at a shop in Germany, it's the #1 seller, and by a huge margin. They're even buying it over the RTX 3060. Look, they've sold 545 4070 Ti's, which destroys every single other GPU. Look at this information here from Video Cards. The source is Tech Epiphany. Look at the numbers. The RTX 4070 Ti destroys every other GPU in GPU sales. I mean, all right, I have one in my hand here, and you might be saying, why did I buy one? Well, I test them, so I have to know if it's good or not, and I bought an open box. Here's the proof. See that? Open box at Best Buy for $679, which for that price, it's actually pretty good. If you buy a 4070 Ti for $679, really much cheaper than the $799 MSRP. That's our problem with this GPU. $799 is simply not worth it, and I need to be able to test it. What if there's something wrong with this GPU that nobody else caught? Or what if perhaps it's really good and people should be buying it? I mean, a lot of people are buying it. Look, that information is from a place in Europe. In the US, people seem to be snapping them up as well. Even this picture here from the thumbnail shows you that somebody had it in their seat and they even buckled it in. You're not going to buckle in the GPU unless you really like it, and if it's really expensive too. So those are going to be the two primary factors. I mean, let's take a look at those sales numbers again, because they're pretty shocking. This is going to be AMD, Nvidia, and Intel GPU sales in the third week at mindfactory. Take a look at that. 4070 Ti, 545 units. And then, of course, the RTX 3060 is in second with 485. The 3060, I think the 3060 Ti is such a better GPU, so that's even a little bit puzzling. It must be have to do with availability, because look, the 3060 Ti, much lower sales at 305. And then the 6700 XT, which I agree with, 410. That one makes sense to be up there, but I think people should be buying the 3060 Ti over the 3060. It's a much better GPU. Even though the 3060 has more VRAM, the 3060 Ti is just a faster GPU. It's more like a cut down 3070. So that may come down to the price. Maybe over the, I'm not too sure what the pricing they're charging over there at mindfactory. Maybe that's all it is, and maybe it's a lot more expensive than the 3060. Everything else is kind of what you would expect. I mean, the 7900 XTX, I mean, that's selling pretty well, but of course, it's going to be the newest, fastest GPU from AMD, so that makes complete sense. You know, even the 4090, the only reason the 4090 isn't #1 is that it's so expensive, and the pricing there is probably more than the US, but I bet you the 4090, in the US at least, it sells out everywhere that I see it. Everything else seems to make sense. I mean, even the 4080 is selling an okay amount, 190 units there. 3070 Ti still selling too, so that's interesting. But definitely the most surprising one here, or maybe not surprising, is the 4070 Ti. So being at the #1 spot, that tells you that people were waiting for the next generation Nvidia GPU to finally drop down below $1,000. The 4080, especially in Europe, is going to be a little bit more expensive than in the US that we're used to at like Best Buy or Micro Center. So most people, maybe they don't want to buy it. But the 4070 Ti probably comes in at a much more attractive price, and people think, well, it's almost as good, right, as like a 4080. People were saying that it was as good as a 3090 Ti, and it's going to be hundreds of dollars less than a 4080. Has DLSS 3.0, and usually you see like this cooler here is a little bit smaller than the 4080 or 4090 coolers. And of course, especially this one still has the the power adapter, but it's only 2. It's not 4 like the 4090. So some people, I could see how people could rationalize and think, this is a good GPU, and it's really not a bad GPU at all. I mean, at 4K, I would not buy this, but if you're doing 1440p, it's going to max out most games. Even with ray tracing and the highest settings, you should be pretty much okay. You might have to tweak a couple of things, maybe something really graphically intensive. You might have to bring it down to stay over 60 frames, but a lot of games you'll definitely hit over 144 hertz easily, frames per second, with this at 1440p. My problem with it is at 4K, which I think, in my opinion, even if Nvidia says it's a 1440p GPU, if if you're spending 800 bucks on this, why did they cut down that memory bus bandwidth so much? All right, 12 gigabytes of VRAM is one limitation. It should really be 16 at this point for something this expensive. Remember, there should have been a 4080 that Nvidia wanted to sell all that. So that's like the first bad thing against it. And then that memory bus limitation, it's hard to like quantify where it's bad and where it isn't because people don't benchmark that. Nobody tests for that, memory bus limitation really. You have to feel it in the game and then kind of guess that that's what it is. Unless you talk to an Nvidia GPU or a game developer or engineer, something like that, you're not going to know exactly what's going on. But from talking to different people and feeling the effects compared to a 4090, that's going to be my best hypothesis as why this kind of stutters sometimes, not all the time at 4K, in Tale Requiem with the highest settings possible. I saw stutters with this as it hit that VRAM limit at the 12 gigabyte of VRAM. And even when it's a little bit lower, maybe the resolution with the memory bus bandwidth, with ray tracing, I don't think it's fast enough to keep up with this at 4K. Understanding many buyers won't play at 4K with this GPU. It's just nice if it could do it for the price, especially if they're comparing it to a 3090 Ti, which won't have these same problems because that one has really fast VRAM and it has 24 gigabytes of it. So that's an entirely different class of GPU, even if the rasterization at 1440p is similar, and this has DLSS 3.0 and of course much lower power consumption, which is impressive. The power consumption is nice on this GPU, under 300 watts. For that type of performance, definitely not bad, but don't get this for 4K. This is a 1440p GPU, and I tested this in my system with various games. Okay at 4K with lower settings. If you want to max it out, as you should with an $800 GPU, you're going to be disappointed, so just keep that in mind. Testing this GPU for $679, it's good, but I did find some pretty significant issues. They're all going to have to do with 4K, however. I know this is not a 4K GPU. You should be using a 4080 for that or a 7900 XT, but this is a GPU that's $799 that most people are paying, and you would think that it should do 4K. I mean, people are comparing this guy to the 3090 Ti, but let me tell you something. It is no 3090 Ti. Yes, it does in rasterization at 1440p equal the 3090 Ti. With DLSS 3.0, it can really embarrass that GPU as well. But here is what I found out by actually throwing this in my system and playing it. At 4K, depending on the game, it's going to absolutely cripple this GPU because the memory bus is only 192-bit, not to mention the VRAM is 12 gigabytes. It's not going to be important if you're playing a 1080p or 1440p for the most part, but I threw this in first. Played Tale Requiem, which is a very beautiful game, very graphically intensive. They updated it to have ray traced shadows now. I threw this in there, and at 4K, it was like a stuttering mess if I try to max everything out. Here's the kicker. The frames per second still looked decent. Like I was still getting pretty good frames, but the behavior of the GPU was weird. It was like choppy, a little bit stuttering, which leads me to believe that it was running up against that VRAM limitation because of course it was pretty much at 12 gigabytes. It was running like 11,000 something gigabytes of VRAM. So it was like touching that surface. When I run that same game on the 4090, it easily goes over that. I've even seen as high as about 14 gigabytes of VRAM when you have everything on Ultra, 4K. We're not even talking about 8K or anything, 4K. And then of course you have it on DLAA, which for this game is going to be the most graphically intensive one. So you have to put it on something like DLSS 3.0 with frame generation on the 4070 Ti, maybe like the quality or balance setting. If you turn a couple things down, then at 4K, it does okay. But if you try to push this even a little bit, it starts to stutter and it starts to not perform well. And I think it's not only the 12 gigabyte of VRAM being a limitation, but also 192-bit memory bus. If Nvidia had made the bandwidth faster on this guy, even with 12 gigabytes of VRAM, I think this would have done better. In fact, I have a 3080 Ti that I'm going to actually test against this as well. I'm pretty sure it's probably going to give smoother performance. Even with the same 12 gigabytes of VRAM, that one has faster memory bandwidth, much faster than the 192-bit that this has. Now, most people are not going to talk about this limitation aside from a couple of articles and some of the review, because this is a GPU that's targeted at 1440p. Most people that are buying this as a consumer probably do not want to use it for 4K, because that's going to be an entirely different class of GPU. But why wouldn't you use this at 4K? I mean, at over $800 MSRP, this should do 4K. Look at AMD's 7900 XT, which, by the way, doesn't have the same memory limitations as this. It has 20 gigabytes of VRAM and not this 192-bit limited memory bus either. So something like that at only $100 more is going to destroy this almost in every single scenario, aside from maybe some ray tracing, especially at 4K. So you have to really think about what your use case is going to be. If you never plan to upgrade to 4K monitors are getting cheaper and cheaper. Some of the best technology pretty soon will be focused on 4K. You see, like, for example, I've been trying out the LG 42-inch C2. That's a 4K TV. So if you want OLED, there aren't that many options for OLED at like 1440p. Most of them are going to be 4K and above, just because that's where all of the eye candy is. Some like ultra wide models are coming out soon that are OLED, but aside from that, 4K is starting to be a pretty good resolution. So do you really want to pay over $800 for a GPU that has that big of an issue? All right, guys, remember to subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.